Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. This episode was supposed to be the one that was supposed to be at the end of the year, but it got moved up to this year. I don't know if this makes it better or worse, although I think it's actually better that it happened this way, because turns out the election that was supposed to be the second to last one that I was going to cover is actually going to be way more interesting than this one. Not to say this one isn't interesting, it is, but we'll get to that in a bit. But before we get into that election, let's get right into the news. And we'll be talking about another foreign election. Another update just happened. Well, not just happened. Happened right after I posted or recorded the last episode. And it's in regards to the Guatemalan election again. You see, because what happened is Sandra Torres and Zuri Rios have, and I think Manuel Conde, they all submitted, and a bunch of other parties, submitted something to the Supreme Tribunal of Guatemala, alleging that this election that just happened was marred with some form of corruption, and this corruption benefited the Semilia movement and Bernardo Arevalo, that there's no way that he could get in the runoff and not any of us. And as such, they've tried to make it so that he is no longer going to be in the runoff. Bernardo Arevalo is, of course, fighting like hell to get him to keep his spot on the ticket. And a lot of other countries around the world have basically said, what the F? The UN, the OAS, the US, UK, and the EU are telling everybody to respect the decision because they don't really see any accusation. They don't really see anything that would indicate. This is the part where it gets a little interesting. They say they deny any accusations of electoral fraud, and it's in this particular case, no. But this election was marred in a lot of electoral fraud, mostly through the kicking off of candidates who were not going to be. They kicked off 3-4 prominent candidates, and they were going to kick off more. Bernardo Arevalo, the reason why he's on, it's actually surprising that he is on the ballot, because they did try to get him removed from the ballot. I don't know if it was specifically Sandra Torres, or if it was just a blanket, statement against him and his party, but Semilia, they've also been kicked off the ballot before. In 2019, their candidate was kicked off the ballot for whatever reason. The leftist candidates always get the shaft in the electoral system of Guatemala. Guatemala's electoral system is very corrupt and is marred in a ton of electoral fraud, but they'll also use those same methods to try and stop actual change. Bernardo Arevalo would be a big improvement to Guatemala. He would be a great leader of Guatemala if his father is any indication. Granted, I already know that he is less radical than his father. He's more of a social democrat, a more avowed social democrat. Meanwhile, his father was more of an explicit socialist. But the fact of the matter is, he would be much better improvement over the current presidents that Guatemala has, and Sandra Torres. He would be a vast improvement over all of them. I stopped short from labeling him as a next pink tide leader, because I don't necessarily know if he would necessarily count as pink tide, maybe to a degree, because he's, left of center. But there's also, there are other left-of-center leaders that aren't necessarily considered pink tide, especially considering I don't know if it's, this particular wave of the pink tide is going to have, certain big pet issues, because one big pet issue of a lot of the newer pink tide leaders is the changing of affiliation in regards to China. A lot of the newer pink tide leaders, they say that they would push to try and make their countries closer to China rather than Taiwan, which is what a lot of Latin American countries already have a close relationship to. Bernardo Arevalo has already made it pretty clear that if he were president, he would not change the current status of Taiwan and China in Guatemala. I don't know if this position is malleable, because I think Xiomara Castro had the exact opposite position, where she was rallying to be I'm going to be the pro-China candidate, and then she shifted when she made it to the actual presidency to be more conciliatory to Taiwan. All I know is, either way, if it's Torres or Arevalo, I'll be very heavily involved in the Wikipedia war that will ensue, and if any of you are listening to this, be sure which side you are on whenever that situation happens. If Torres ends up winning the presidency, she should not be on the list of pink tide leaders whatsoever, unless something happens in her administration that truly does solidify it. But if Bernardo Arevalo is, At most, he should be in disputed pink tide leader list. But I would also be fine if he just weren't on the list at all. Speaking of lists and foreign elections, Mexico, remember them? I know I covered Guatemala and Mexico in the last video, but I'm covering them again in this video. I promise this will probably be the last time I talk about the Mexican presidential election up until the registration of candidates is complete. Because the Frente Amplio Mexico, or Vapor Mexico, or whatever, many people have already started running and announcing and joining in the fray of the candidates. The last time I talked about this, Xochitl Galvez was the only person to announce that they were running. But in the time since then, we have had quite a number of people who have announced. 15 new faces have entered the scene, to be exact. Granted, a lot of these new faces are basically nobodies that have no bearing on Mexican politics whatsoever, although some of them are a little interesting. Like, there's one guy, Israel Rivas, who is interesting because he's an advocate for children with cancer. Like he decries the fact that children with cancer in Mexico have to fight for their insulin or whatever, like their medicine or whatever, and they're just like, he wants them to have better access to medical care. Commendable effort, but it's like, why are you running for president in this party again? And then another candidate that is interesting is Victor Gutierrez Yanez, who actually ran for office as a member of the Labor Party at one point. It's like, okay, so what the heck are you doing in this primary? But let's just get into the ones that are actually prominent that are worth mentioning. First, one of the earliest ones to announce was Santiago Creel Miranda, making another run for the presidency. I actually do think that he has a decent chance this time. He's sort of steadily become the new face of the Mexican opposition. Then there's Francisco Garcia of the PAN, Jorge Luis Preciado of the PAN, and an interesting face to enter the scene, Gabriel Quadri, who is also a member of the PAN right now, has made known that he's going to run for president. The PRI's two candidates are Enrique de la Madrid and Beatriz Paredes, two people that are very prominent within the PRI opposition to Morena. And last, and certainly least, there's Silvano Aureoles, former governor of Michoacan of the PRD. And his announcement is hilarious. Like, when I saw his announcement, it was funny because I clicked a link to see a website where he's explaining how he wants this coalition to be a progressive leftist alternative for the future of Mexico. And it's just like, what the heck are you even doing in this primary? Like, you are literally running with the candidate of the old guard of Mexico. Now, the process isn't over yet, I don't think, so we still have to wait and see how many more people are going to be entering the scene. But at this point, it does seem like Santiago Creel and Beatriz and Enrique de la Madrid are probably going to be the three front runners for the nomination. Silvano will only be there just to be a torchbearer for his party, but it is very unlikely that he will become the nominee. Now, as you may have noticed, the MC is not in that race right now, and it doesn't seem like they will be, because the Citizens Movement has already made an announcement that they're going to try and stop this whole process from even taking place, because they're worried that under the INE's current rules, in Mexico, they have very strict rules in regards to campaigning. Like, you can only campaign on certain days, and apparently, these two processes are happening before the actual official election season begins in Mexico. And they're saying that by definition, these two processes are breaking the rules. So it seems that the Citizens Movement might not be involved in this contention. And they've already made it pretty clear that they probably won't be running for the sake of we don't negotiate with the old guard, which puts them in the prime position to be the actual opposition party in this election. And even the MC is starting to look at their presidential campaign a bit more seriously, with one of the frontrunners for the race that they've wanted to run for a while, Enrique Alfaro Ramirez, the governor of Jalisco. They've wanted him to run for a while, but he has finally announced that he is not interested in seeking the presidency. Making it very clear, he stated very clearly for a long time, he will only run in races he thinks he can win. And clearly that means he can't win this race. And I'm going to take a wild guess and say that Luis Colosio is probably the one that's going to be the most likely to be the nominee, because I think Samuel Spivolda is probably going to be focusing a lot more on his gubernatorial adventures, but we'll have to wait and see. Speaking of elections and having to wait to see, some U.S. election news has actually started coming in. Pretty interesting. I think the U.S. election season for America is starting to fully happen, because we're seeing a lot of races starting to get filled. And one race that is going to be filled is the New York District 17 race, with Mondare Jones launching a comeback bid for the House. For those who don't remember Mondare Jones and the whole situation surrounding him, well, let me explain. Mondare Jones was a gay black man who decided in 2020 to run for Congress in District 17 against the 16-term incumbent Nita Lowey. But then, 3 months into the race, Nita announced that she wouldn't be running for re-election at all, which turned this race into an incredibly open one. 7 more people entering the scene, and due to many factors, some of which relating to COVID and some of which relating to the fact that many of the candidates were arguably hitting similar ilks ideologically and racial-wise, Mondare Jones ended up squeezing through the primary, and he won. And that made him into one of 2 gay black men to win elections to Congress that year, the other being Richie Torres in the 15th district. Another prominent black progressive elected in that same time period was Jamal Bowman in the neighboring 16th district, each of which coming from similar but different ideological ilks. Richie Torres was more of a Democrat, meanwhile Jamal Bowman was more of a squad Democrat and a socialist. Meanwhile Mondare Jones was a in-between. He was definitely more left-wing than Torres, but he was definitely more right-wing than Bowman. And that led to a little bit of a mixed reaction, but for the most part, people were genuinely, happy with Mondare Jones, thinking he was a pretty good candidate, he was a pretty good, congressman, aside from, a few hiccups, which would put him a lot more in lines with Torres than with Bowman, but otherwise, he was genuinely pretty fine. But then came the New York redistricting of 2022, and they made some very interesting changes, basically redrawing the districts to basically just switch certain areas. And one of the changes was that the neighboring 18th district that was held by Sean Patrick Maloney was now drawn to be slightly more red. And due to this, Sean Patrick Maloney, as soon as these new maps were dropped, immediately announced that he would be running in Mondare Jones's district, leaving Mondare Jones a little bit in between a rock and a hard place. While yes, technically nothing was stopping him from running against Maloney, he was not really that comfortable with a primary bid, especially with a Democrat of that stature. Remember, he was originally going to primary somebody, but then that person dropped out, which gave him an easy path to the nomination. So doing this was a little bit scary, so what he had to do next was he had to find a different district to run in. But the districts that he was now drawn into were the districts of Jamal Bowman and Richie Torres, 2 other black freshman Democrats that were pretty much seen as on his level ideologically. And for many reasons, Mondare Jones didn't want to put another Democratic freshman congressman on this same path, because that's the reason why they put Mondare Jones on this path. He was a new congressman, easily expendable, but also they wanted him to run in a certain one of those 2 districts. They wanted him to run against Bowman. Many top Democratic officials, Black Caucus members, and Eliot Engel supporters were telling Mondare Jones, run against Bowman and we will back you. Now, there are some people on the progressive left sphere that try to push this conspiracy theory that they were trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, have Mondare Jones and the Jamal Bowman fight each other, and then they would all give their support to a corporate centrist. But no, that's not what was going to happen. Because that's too much work. You don't understand how this works. In order to get rid of an ideological member of Congress that you don't like, is that you draw them in a district with a member of an ideological faction that you do like, and then you just have them fight it out. And of the two, Mondare Jones was more willing to play ball than Bowman. The Republicans did that same thing with Alex Mooney and Dave McKinley. They also did one with Carolyn Boudreaux and Lucy McBath, where they basically drew the one person who was like a little bit more hostile to the Democratic Party. In the 2012 elections, they did it to Kucinich and Brad Miller. They do this all the time. Oh yeah, and for the record, like Sean Patrick Mulroney failed in his own district, and the district that he left remained blue, with Pat Ryan winning the seat. So literally, Mondare Jones was screwed for nothing. Oh yeah, I should mention even more of how he got screwed, because what he decided to do was that rather than running in any of those districts close to him, or just flat out retiring from Congress, he decided that he was going to run in a district that he was nowhere close to living in, because it was an open seat. Like, it was a new open seat that had no incumbent. And he ended up getting third, and many people blame him as the reason why we don't have a left-wing member of Congress in that seat. But I'm just going to mention this. I haven't endorsed Mondare Jones yet, because I want to see how he took this loss. I want to see if he still remains the progressive that he once was. Because sometimes when this happens, people will then choose to think, oh, the reason why I did this was because I was too far left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift the center. And it's like, if Mondare Jones goes that route, then I don't want to support him. And I'm seeing hints of that because he hasn't mentioned any policies on his website thus far. His campaign announcement is basically stoking the sort of like lib resistance type voters. And he's basically been retweeting a ton of them nonstop. Ergo, I don't know if he's going to be a really good... I don't know what's going to happen next. Speaking of things I don't know what will happen next, sadly, this is one where a race could have been good, but it might not be anymore. Jamie Raskin has decided to not run for the Maryland Senate seat and is instead going to seek re-election. Now, I was actually very interested in seeing Jamie Raskin running for Senate. Granted, he, like many people now, like a lot of his more recent attention was on resistance libs, but I really was like, this guy would make a pretty good candidate for Senate, and I've been a supporter of his for a little bit. Is he the most progressive person ever? No. Is he a pretty good progressive? Absolutely. But unfortunately, given his recent cancer diagnosis and recovery, it does seem like trying to vie for a new race is going to be troubling. There is still hope yet, because another person that was very interested in running for the seat was Ben Jealous. But he always sort of turned it down because he always wanted Raskin to run. But since Raskin's not going to enter, there's a chance that Jealous could run for the seat again. Well, not again, he hasn't run for the Senate yet, but he would make an interesting candidate. Though, if not, we do have Jerome Segal. Anyways, next is actually a sad story. Biden has chosen to nominate Eliott Abrams to be the Public Diplomacy Commission. Now, what's funny is that they keep referring to Eliott Abrams as a controversial former Trump appointee, when they should just point blank explain, like, Eliott Abrams very... basically, Latin American death squads. Like, I mean, this is a massive L for Biden. It's not really going to play much effort into the election or, like, choices of who people will vote for in the upcoming election. But the fact of the matter is, it is still a very troubling thing that Biden has chosen to do. Though it is expected that this was going to be what happened. Maybe not to this degree, but it's like, you can't get your hopes up with, like, a liberal, like, Dem president. You can only get your hopes up for a progressive Dem president. Now, why don't we shift this to a Democrat that actually can get some praise? Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers. Now, here's an interesting thing that he did, and it made massive rounds on the internet when it happened, because it's such a weird thing that I didn't know how to think of it at first, but it's just kind of funny now in retrospect. Wisconsin, their vetoes are a little different than ours. You see, for the presidency and for a lot of other like legislative and executive bodies, the veto power goes like this. You bring them a bill, and if they don't like it, they have to veto the whole bill, even if they don't like one aspect of it. and then they send it back, and then you're supposed to then renegotiate and refigure out how to make this bill into law, either by overriding the veto or rewriting the bill so that the executive doesn't veto it. But in Wisconsin, they realized that this process could take a long time, so what ends up happening is that they introduce the idea of a line item veto, which is something where they can basically just cross out the parts of the bill that they don't like and then get rid of that specific part, but then sign on to the parts that they agree on. And what happened is the Republican-controlled legislature passed a budget plan that was supposed to detail a lot of things, and one of the things they tackled were education. And here's the section in question. Section 402, 121.905, 3C9, the statutes in the created to read, for the limit of the 2023-24 school year and the 2024-25 school year, add $325 to the result under Par B. Basically, it was supposed to be a small increase to the budget of those two school years. Well, Tony Evers did something really weird in regards to this veto. What he decided to do was he vetoed the words the 24 school year and the 20-school year, and then signed on to the bill as it was after vetoing those words. If you're confused about, what does that mean? Well, let's read over what the bill now says. For the limit for 2023 through 24-25, add $325 to the result under par. Basically guaranteeing that schools will be getting a small budget increase for 402 years. And from the way everybody seems to be going crazy, it appears that there might not be anything they can do about this, because Republicans were going apeshit over this, and Tony Evers was just laughing it up. And I think this is going to lead to a bit of a shift in the Democratic Party. Well, not necessarily a shift. It's kind of one that already kind of is a thing, but we're seeing it nowadays where a lot of the Midwestern Democrat governors are now being seen a lot more favorably than the places that that people on the left are supposed to like more. Because, the coastal elites are not being looked at fondly anymore, so now it's up to the rural type people to get in gear. And it makes sense that these two areas, particularly like Minnesota and Wisconsin, are doing well, because those are the areas that have a huge history in left-wing activity. And for those of you who say that voting doesn't matter, Tony Evers won the last election by 3 points and got in the election by barely a percentage point. And this is what happens when the left actually turned out to vote. Speaking of turning out and voting, let's move on to the main topic of this video, where we're going to be talking about a country that does plan on voting sometime soon. Spain. Spain's going to be a little interesting because it's technically one of those ones that it's like a European leader power, but it has a lot of relationships with Latin American countries, and not for necessarily the best reasons, but it does have a history with Latin America, and we'll see a little bit about that in this election, actually. Not too much. I'm not gonna, when I go over the backstory of this election, I don't have to go too far. I don't have to go, back in the conquistador era. No. I don't have to do that, because since this is a Western, imperial power, we don't have to go that far back to truly understand the modern day politics of the country. So let's just get into it to explain how we got to the point we are now. Spain, much like a lot of European countries, used to be run by a monarchy, but pro-Republican sentiment was rising in Spain, and eventually, after elections held in 1931, showing that anti-monarchy parties were winning by large amounts, the king took the hint and decided to leave, which then led to the remaining parties to form a republic. And as a republic goes, sometimes they lean right, sometimes they lean left. But things got interesting when the left got power in 1936, as that year, a group of people known as the Nationalists tried to initiate a coup against the newly elected left-wing Republican government, which inevitably spiraled into a full-on civil war. Not to bore you with the details, but unfortunately, Spain fell and was taken over by a man named Francisco Franco, a man who, for lack of a better term, is a fascist. Historians like to debate on how accurate the term is, especially considering Franco himself never actually used the term to describe himself. The terms that he used instead were phalangism, national synarchism, totalitarian state, and, the funniest one, organic democracy. But all these terms essentially mean fascist. Like this, they all cover the same beats: anti-communist, anti-Mason, anti-Jew, pro-Catholic, pro-corporation, pro-monarchy. Well, on paper. You see, Franco, he actually had this weird relationship with the Spanish monarchy, where he, since the right wing of Spain loved monarchy, Franco had to say, oh, I love the monarchy too. But of course, if he actually appointed a monarchy, then that would mean that he would have to give away power. So what he ended up doing was he didn't really end up appointing a monarchy, especially considering the monarchist in question that he had to appoint to be the successor was to his left. So he just decided to kind of weasel around it and just be like, oh, I guess I just can't really appoint a monarchy. And he would remain the leader of Spain until his death. To which Spain basically just hit the rewind button. The monarchy was officially back, and so too was, republicanism, which basically led them to sort of have a center-leaning consensus of Western democracies. Center-right, center-left usually being the mainstream politics and not really veering too far in either direction. And this is the part where we can just skip all the way to the most current administration, because really, we'll get into some of this stuff when we actually start talking about the parties and candidates. So let's just get into who is the current leader of Spain. The current Prime Minister of Spain is a man by the name of Pedro Sanchez, who is definitely a noticeable and long-standing social democrat, but he has tried to appeal to the harder left in Spain for recent years, forming a coalition with a long-standing thorn to his side, Pablo Iglesias. Generally, Pedro Sanchez was an okay leader, did fine on COVID, tried to push Spain to be more prominent in the world scene, but it seemed that people just started growing tired of him, as the right-wing opposition got a combined 38.7, almost a 10-point lead in the most recent election. And as such, Sanchez has decided to declare an early election in order to make sure that all of his COVID measures that he implemented were not ruined by the right. As that implies, one of the main issues will be in regards to sort of COVID, maintaining certain COVID elements. I guess they're sort of like social welfare states. But for the most part, this is sort of this is actually kind of like a blander election, I guess, in retrospect. I guess it's good that this one didn't get put to the end, because this one's a little bit more bland, but a little bit more interesting when I get into certain things. Okay, we'll just get into the candidates and parties. Spain is a country that has quite a number of political parties. A total of 22 represented are in their parliament. However, only 6 of the parties are nationwide, 4 that are actually competing in the election. The rest are a little bit interesting because they are regional parties that advocate for issues for their home provinces, which means they have limited reach with not that much prominence. But since they do have some prominence, I can't just flat out ignore them. So as such, this is going to be one of those ones where I'm going to go over all of the parties, but for some of them, will be shorter than the others. You see, first we're going to start off with the regional parties, which, since the regional parties really don't have a chance at winning any sort of election, they'll win in whatever areas they need to win in. Or maybe not, I don't know. But since they don't have that much say in the broader election, they're not really going to be mentioned that much. You're going to get the ideology they represent and the area they represent. Alright, first on the agenda, we have the Gomera Socialist Group, a smaller socialist party only on one of the Canary Islands, La Gomera. They only have 1 seat, so no need to elaborate. Empty Spain, a small agrarian party that represents the largely rural and unpopulated interior provinces. The Galician Nationalist Bloc, a left-wing political party wanting the autonomous community of Galicia to have more autonomy. Originally, it was more of an independence party, but it has sort of softened a little bit, sort of like the Bloc Québécois. The New Canaries, a left-wing nationalist party representing the interests of the broader Canary Isles. Then there's the Canarian Coalition, a centrist Canarian nationalist party. Next we have E.H. Bildu, an Abertzale left party advocating for Basque independence. You see, Abertzale left is meaning patriotic left, and the Basques are an indigenous population that has an autonomous region of their own. Basically, they're advocating for that area to be an independent nation that governs itself. Next, we have the Basque National Party, a Basque nationalist political party that has social democratic and Christian democratic tendencies. The Popular Unity candidacy, which is an anti-capitalist party advocating for Catalan independence. Then we have the Catalan European Democratic Party, a Catalan independence and pro-European party. Next we have Together for Catalonia, a centre-right populist Catalan independence party. But the most prominent of the parties that are regional are the Republican Left of Catalonia, a left-wing Catalan independence party. Now the reason why I say the most prominent one is because the last election, the party had 13 seats. The next largest one is the Together for Catalonia, which currently only has 4 seats. And as I stated, since these parties are sort of like nowhere close to even getting the amount of seats needed to win, they're really not that much of more than a footnote in the race. At most, they'll play roles in choosing the current government. Like, the ones that have more left-leanings will probably join with the left-wing coalition, and maybe the more right-leaning regional parties will choose to join with the right-wing opposition. But at the end of the day, it seems that there are only 4 parties that actually have a legitimate chance of being prominent on the scene in regards to the election. Now, they're divided into 2 categories. The main 2, the ones who are probably going to more than likely get a prime minister in, and the 2 that are more of coalition partners. We'll start off with the coalition partners. First is Sumar, a left-wing political alliance of many left-wing parties to form a popular front to combat the Spanish right. There are many parties in this coalition, but there are really only 2 that are prominent that I'll mention. First is United Left, a communist political alliance of extremely small communist parties, but the one that you all probably know more is Podemos, an anti-austerity and left-wing populist party that has been a long-standing political party of the Spanish left since 2014. Founded and led by Pablo Iglesias until recently, it remains a pretty relatively popular force, even if it is significantly less than it was at its time. Now, I was originally a little perplexed that Podemos didn't just run in and of itself, but that was until I started looking further into their leader of the Sumar coalition. That leader is Yolanda Diaz, the 2nd Deputy Prime Minister of Spain and Minister of Labor and Social Economy of the United Left. So that makes it make more sense. She is not a member of Podemos, which is why she doesn't want to run under Podemos or the currently established left-wing coalition Unidas Podemos. This is essentially the United Left's turn to be the new leader of the Spanish left. Will it work? I don't know. But in a way, I get it. I do understand that a lot of the worldwide left needs to sort of start growing out of its reliance on certain figures and parties, that we need to move past them sometimes. For example, the Pink Tide, a lot of them really will just try to run the same people for office over and over and over again until they die. Who ended up having to save the day in the Brazilian election? Lula. Who is one of the leading contenders for the possible next Bolivian election? Evo. Who is one of the names floated for the potential Ecuadorian election? Correa. Who's one of the people being floated for the potential next election for France? Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Who is floated as a potential torchbearer for the left in 2024? Bernie. We keep relying on these old figures to save the day, but it's like we need to move past them eventually. If we do not move past them while they are still here, what are we going to do when they inevitably are gone? The next party that is running is a party known as Vox, a far-right party formed in 2014 to oppose the center-right mainstream party, which is steadily rising in Spain. This is the only party with an explicit religion, Roman Catholic. They want to abolish all of the autonomous communities in Spain. Coincidentally, all the autonomous communities are usually based on a minority group and lean left-wing. Interesting. They also seem to be heavily involved in American politics for some reason, making a formal statement on the 2020 election saying that Biden was the candidate of, quote, El País, Podemos, Otegi, Maduro, China, Iran, and pedophiles. But a big thing they did was that they drafted a document called the Madrid Charter, opposing the spread of communism, which they have basically sent to a ton of far-right parties around the world to try and get them to sign and say, we need to stop communism, basically trying to hype up the Red Scare tactics of yesteryear. And again, for some reason they have this weird connection with America and its politics, trying to harken themselves a lot like Trump, even to the point where they apparently copied a campaign ad that he did, where they just released a campaign ad not that long ago. When I say just released, I mean literally just released it, where they are literally having, they're literally trying to harken on the whole, Latino thing. And many people argue, wait, Latino isn't a thing outside of the U.S., but it's Spain apparently wants to make it a thing because they're literally trying to get people who are Latino, people from Mexico, all these other countries, Venezuela, and they made an ad specifically targeting them, Latino. You might be able to find the ad. It's been spread a lot. If you follow Populism Updates, the ad was posted there. And their leader is the Chamber of Deputies member and party founder, Santiago Abascal. The next party is the mainstream center-right party, the People's Party. Now, this party, even though Vox is portrayed as the far-right party, the center-right party isn't really that much more impressive. It has a tradition within Francoism. It was founded by a guy who was quite very central in Franco's regime, but also who was very instrumental in forming post-Franco democracy. You see, very interesting, a lot of right-wing European parties formed after fascist regime have traditions in post-fascism, where they have this weird nostalgia for the fascist rulers of the past, but they just pretend they aren't fascist. However, similar to Franco, they're really good at somehow making it seem that they are less fascist than they actually are. Appealing to the West. Interesting the fact that they didn't really, Spain didn't really get that much shit after the World War II. Only Japan, Nazi Germany, and, fascist Italy did. Their leader is a senator by the name of Alberto Núñez Feijóo. And the last party is, of course, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, the long-standing Social Democratic Party in Spain. They are led by Pedro Sanchez, which we've already talked a little bit about before, so why don't we just move on to the polling, because polling is where things get a little interesting. You see, first, there are two types of polling. One poll is being conducted about preferred leadership, and the other is the general party polling. And both of these paint a little bit of a different picture. So we'll actually start off with the leadership polling, because the leadership polling is a little bit more interesting. For starters, why don't we look at the leader ratings, because this is just how they rank the leaders. Of the leaders, here are the things. It's of a scale of 0 to 10, 0 means terrible, and 10 means excellent. Of all the leaders of the parties, which one do people like the most? And let's just say this. I'll just say this. None of the results get higher than 5%, but who ends up winning a majority of the time is actually interesting. The one that is usually regarded as the most favorable are like Yolanda Diaz usually gets favorited, but when she isn't, Fehio is the one who ends up getting the one who is leading. Again, none of them end up getting like 10, or like they definitely don't get 10. None of them get higher than 5, but they definitely are in the 4 ranges. Sanchez isn't ranked that far away either, but not more than those guys. With that, you might be thinking, okay, so then what about the like rankings in general? Like, how do people like them versus hate them? Well, of the people, let's look at the approval, disapproval of Yolanda Diaz. Okay, so Yolanda Diaz has, the most recent poll has a net disapproval of 9. And, let's see, Santiago Abascal, net disapproval of 62.7. And let's see, that's the other guy who was the guy. Net disapproval of Fehio, the most recent poll, is down by 46. And lastly, Pedro Sanchez, net disapproval of 18. So technically, it looks like he is regarded... Well, actually, no, again, Yolanda is regarded as the, I guess, most favorable of the guys. So wait, let's check the approval rating for this one. Okay, Yolanda Diaz, most recent one, 40 approval. Okay, Abascal, 14 approval. Fehio, 21.1 approval, and Sanchez, 38 approval. So yeah, Yolanda Diaz is regarded as the most favorable of all the people, which is very typical for left-wing parties, for their leaders and their platforms to be regarded as very good. But then when push comes to shove, it's like, okay, but like, are you actually going to vote for us? And it's like, no. Next is, of the candidates, who do they prefer to be prime minister? And the most recent polls usually put Sanchez in the lead for some reason. See, let's look at let's look at them, the most recent ones. Most recent one conducted was 9.8 to Sanchez. Before that, it was 1.3 to Fehio. Then 1.8 to Sanchez, 4.2 to Sanchez, 3 to Fehio, 1.7 to Sanchez, 2.1 to Fehio, 5.1 to Fehio, 5 to Sanchez, 0.4 to Fehio. You get my point. For some reason, Sanchez is still regarded as a favorable prime minister. But then when they ask people, okay, but who do you think will be prime minister? Fehio is usually regarded as the one that is almost guaranteed to win. And polling-wise, compared to the parties, you can see why. If you look at the graph of the polls, it originally starts off with Sanchez and the PSOE favorably, but then at some point in between March and June, so I guess April, it drops, and now the PP is regarded favorably. Then they had a brief switch to the point where even like Vox was considered more favorable than the PP, but it has steadily risen again. There is still like divides, like sometimes there's like outlier polls, but for the most part, PP is regarded very much favorably in regards to the elections. Let's look at the leads for them. 6.3, 3.0, 7.8, 1.8, 2.5, 7.9, 8.8, 5.5, 5, 8.6, 6.2, 5.6, 5.2, 8.2, 8.1, 6.2, 9.7, 6.4, 8.1, 3.1, 7.5, 0.2, 2.2, 4.8, 6.8, 8.4. All the way at the bottom, we have an approval that even leans Sanchez, and that is like slightly in favor of Sanchez. And that was after the idea to like make this new election. And this is actually sort of a problem. You see, Sanchez was sort of hoping that calling an election this early would solidify his results, which is a similar thing that happened in Canada, where Justin Trudeau called an election very early on, specifically so that he can get people to support him. And a similar thing happened in the UK as well, where they called a snap election to basically solidify the Tories' lead, Now, the problem isn't necessarily that the PP will win outright. The problem is that they don't think the PP is going to win outright, so they might have to turn to Vox to get more support. And that would be problematic because the PP is already Francoist, so imagine being Francoist, like being in the tradition of a fascist, and having literal fascists whistle in your ear to tell you what to do next. And he wanted to solidify the left-wing vote, so he didn't want to give Sumar and Podemos time to prepare for this upcoming election, but Sumar and Podemos proved him wrong, and they joined in a coalition right before the filing deadline. Now, who to support and back? Well, I mean, unless you're in Spain, this really doesn't mean anything, but I would say the best option for you there is Sumar. Not only are they the best party in the field, but if you are worried about the Vox PP coalition, don't worry. If Sumar and PSOE manage to get more seats, they'll be in a coalition together. Best case scenario, you'll have Sumar leading the coalition. Very unlikely to happen, but again, best case scenario. Actually, best case scenario would be Pablo Iglesias coming back and then becoming the new Prime Minister of Spain. But, you know, it's pretty good otherwise. So yeah, if you are a Spanish viewer, by all means, you should be paying attention to this upcoming election and vote for Sumar. Or if you're going to be a PSOE voter, you know, whatever, you could do that too. Basically, as long as it's not PP or Vox or another right-wing party. I'll even take, like, you voting for, like, a separatist party that is like left-wing, as long as you eventually end up joining the coalition with PSO. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and click the bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.